Welcome to Crimson Clues, the home of thrilling mysteries and shocking twists. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the so you never miss a clue. Now let's start the mystery. Secrets at Alderwick Pier, Chapter 1, The Morning Tide. Fog that had shrouded the coastal village of Alderwick all night was lifting reluctantly, like an old dog woken from sleep. Wisps of gray mist clung to the pier's old boards as Police Officer Hennings conducted his normal morning patrol, his heavy boots echoing hollowly in the wet November air. It was 7:20 when he noticed the man lying unmoving near the pier's end, where the structure protruded boldly into the gray waters of the canal. At first sight, Hennings suspected it was some unlucky soul who had consumed too much alcohol the night before. Such finds were not uncommon in a disadvantaged community like Alderwick. But as he neared, despite himself, the constable's trained eye picked up on details that made his stomach tighten with foreboding. The man lay on his back, arms spread wide, staring blindly at the brightening sky. His costly overcoat was soaked through, not only from the fog, but also from the dark stain that had spread across his chest. Even in the hazy morning light, Hennings could tell that Edmund Castere, the owner of the town's most prominent shipyard, would never again walk purposefully down the pier to inspect his warships. Hennings knelt near the deceased, taking care not to disturb the scene further than required. The bullet wound was now clearly evident, a little, tidy hole in Castere's left side chest that had surely left its mark in his heart. The constable's gaze scoured the nearby surroundings, looking for anything that could point to the killer's identity. The receding tide, on the other hand, had thoroughly cleaned the pier of any footprints or other evidence that could have recounted the narrative of Castere's final moments. The phone call to Inspector Morrison at the county police headquarters was short and to the point. Within minutes, the inquiry machinery was in motion, and by 9 o'clock, the pier had been blocked off with rope, and a small crowd of interested town residents had assembled at a safe distance. They chatted in hushed tones, their voices carrying the shock and macabre interest that murder always brings to peaceful places. Superintendent Battle arrived from London at 10 a.m., summoned by Morrison, who saw right away that Edmund cares. Death may have involved problems beyond the boundaries of local crime. Battle exited the train at Alderwick Station with the measured step of a man who had learned that patience was frequently more useful than haste in criminal investigations. He was a huge man with an ordinary appearance and a face that people struggled to recall precisely. His gray suit was well made but not ostentatious, and his demeanor exuded the quiet authority of someone who had spent years studying human nature at its worst and best. Inspector Morrison, a tiny, tense guy with prematurely gray hair, greeted him at the station, clearly relieved. Morrison replied, "I'm glad you came so quickly, Superintendent," as they proceeded toward the dock. "This enterprise has the entire town in commotion." Castere was not only the area's major employer. He had multiple government contracts for naval building. Battle nodded attentively and said nothing. He'd learned long ago that first impressions, no matter how well-intentioned, may sway an investigation in damaging directions. It is preferable to view the event with fresh eyes and draw his own opinions. The pier stretched out before them, like an accusatory finger pointing toward the dark horizon. Battle strolled carefully along its length, his keen eyes taking in every aspect of the aged planking, the iron bollards where ships were tied down, and the occasional coil of rope or discarded fishing net. When he arrived at the location where Castere's body had been discovered, which was now simply marked by a chalk outline, he paused and stood motionless for several minutes. Finally, he mentioned that the tide turned around 4 a.m. He pointed to a stretch of seaweed and trash approximately 10 feet from where the body had been found, indicating the high water mark. However, our Mr. Castere's was discovered well away from the water's edge, meaning, Morrison inquired. This means he was shot sometime after the tide began to recede, or his body was transported after death. Battle knelt where the chalk traces showed Caster's head had been. P.C. Hennings noticed a missing briefcase in his report. Has anyone at the shipyard confirmed what Caster may have been carrying? His secretary, Miss Apprentice, claimed he frequently carried work home in a brown leather briefcase. She is convinced he took it with him when he left the workplace yesterday evening. Battle got up and dusted off his knees, his actions slow and leisurely. His gaze traveled over the expanding crowd, noting faces, examining emotions, and storing impressions that could be beneficial later. Among the assembled townspeople, he recognized the sharp features and costly dress of a woman who could only be Mrs. Caster, standing slightly away from the others with the dignity of the lately deceased. The fog had cleared completely, presenting Alderwick in all its modest beach charm. The town crowded around the harbor like a collection of old toys, with narrow streets that climbed the moderate slope away from the ocean. But under the lovely surface, Superintendent Battle sensed the currents of suspicion and anxiety that murder always brings to little towns, where everyone knows everyone else's business or believes they do. The investigation had only barely begun, but Battle could already feel the familiar weight of secrets pressing against the surface of apparent respectability. Chapter 2, Caster's Legacy. The Caster residence stood on a hill overlooking Alderwick Harbor. Its Georgian facade reflects the same calm dignity as its mistress. Superintendent Battle entered the mansion through rows of iron gates that had been left discreetly open, observing the well-kept grounds and subtle indicators of riches that spoke of careful administration rather than excessive exhibition. Mrs. Helena Caster greeted him in the morning room, a comfortable chamber with tall windows that provided a commanding view of the pier where her husband's body had been recovered. She was a woman of about 45, with prematurely silver hair styled, with modest elegance and dark eyes that betrayed nothing of her innermost emotions. Her black dress was basic but well cut, and she wore no jewelry other than her wedding ring and a small pearl brooch at her throat. Superintendent Battle, she remarked, rising to welcome him with a poise that spoke of pedigree and years of experience. Keeping up appearances. Inspector Morrison informed me you would be calling. Please sit down. Battle sat down in the designated chair, his keen gaze taking in the room's decor. On the mantelpiece were family photographs, formal portraits of a younger Helena, Edmund Caster in his prime, and a fair-haired young man who could only be Morrison's stepson. Mrs. Caster's battle began as he spoke with the quiet authority that had served him well in countless interviews. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I have a few inquiries about your husband's recent activities. Of course, Helena Caster folded her hands in her lap with meticulous precision. Edmund was dedicated to his work. The shipyard was everything. To him, it was his father's legacy, you understand, and he felt the weight of that obligation deeply. Had he recently seemed bothered or concerned about anything in particular? Before she responded, she paused briefly. The war preparations have placed great strains on all of our shipbuilders. Edmund worked long hours, frequently bringing papers home for study in the evenings. The government contracts necessitate such attention to detail. Battle took mental note of the cautious language. The missing briefcase, but do you have any idea what it contained? Technical drawings, most likely specs for the Navy warships we are building. Edmund was always concerned about security while working for the government. The sound of footsteps in the hall signaled the arrival of a young guy, possibly 22, tall and fair, with classical features that denoted affluence and education. His entry exuded nervous energy, which contrasted strongly with his stepmother's calm manner. "Mother," I heard voices. He came to a sudden halt as he saw the battle, his face flushing slightly. "I beg your pardon. I hadn't realized we had a visitor." "This is Superintendent Battle from London," Helena stated formally. "David, my stepson, David Caster." Battle rose to shake hands, observing the young man's solid grip and a tiny quiver that indicated careful strain management. "Mr. Cast, I'm sorry to hear about your father. Thank you. David's speech had the sophisticated accents of Cambridge, but there was an underlying tension that indicated recent stress. It's all very shocking, actually. One simply does not expect this to happen in Alderwick. Has your father recently expressed any concerns about the business? Battle inquired, returning his seat and eyeing both stepmother and son closely. David took a brief peek at Helena before responding. Naturally, there has been pressure on the war contracts. Father seemed to be working harder than usual, but the yard's never been busier. Surely, that is a good thing. Indeed, Battle allowed for a comfortable silence to develop, which was one of his most effective investigative strategies. People, he discovered, were uncomfortable with quiet and frequently filled it with unexpected insights. Helena spoke first. The business has always faced obstacles. Superintendent Edmund developed it on what his father left, although competition has increased in recent years. These government contracts have been a wonderful blessing. How long has your husband been with his companion, Mr. Brennan? Thomas has been with the firm for nearly 10 years, Helena said. He controls much of the day-to-day operations, while Edmund focused on the technical elements and client connections. Battle sensed undercurrents in the precisely bland remark, and their collaboration was harmonious. Another slight pause. As cordial as any commercial relationship, I imagine they had differing perspectives on certain issues, but this is not uncommon between partners. David squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. Mr. Brennan has always been cautious about his viewpoint. Father was more willing to take calculated chances in the pursuit of growth. Helena gave a harsh look that she hastily suppressed, but not before Battle noticed. The family dynamics were definitely more complex than the surface indicated, with tensions that extended beyond mere sadness over the patriarch's death. I believe you have lately returned from university, Mr. Castair, Battle remarked, directing his gaze to the young man. So what are your plans now? Of course, I intended to join the firm. Father was determined for me to learn the business from the ground up. David's voice held a tinge of doubt that suggested such ambitions might now be in question. Battle spent another quarter hour asking mild questions that gave no new information, but verified his increasing suspicion that the Castair family was hiding secrets beneath its veneer of respectable grief. When he finally left, Helena and David escorted him to the door with the politeness of folks eager to see their visitor leave. Battle mused on the interview as he walked back down the hill into the town center. The widow's poise was wonderful, but possibly too faultless, and the stepson's uneasiness implied remorse over something, albeit whether it was related to his father's death remained to be seen. The missing bag had certainly contained something significant, but Battle began to think that its significance may not have been as obvious as it appeared. The afternoon sun had burst through the morning's gloomy clouds, sending sharp shadows across Alderwick's small alleys as Battle made his way to his next meeting with Thomas Brennan. The town appeared quiet in the daylight, but murder had a way of exposing the darker currents that ran beneath the surface of even the most respectable places. Chapter 3. Shadows from Abroad. Castair's shipbuilding offices were housed in a solid brick structure on Harbor Street, with windows overlooking the busy yard, where the skeletal frames of 2 naval vessels rose like sleeping giants' ribs. Superintendent Battle discovered Thomas Brennan in the main office, surrounded by ledgers and plans, with his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the November chill that permeated the building's walls. Brennan was a small man in his early 50s, with thinning dark hair and weathered hands that spoke of years of practical experience before moving into management. His welcome was polite enough, but Battle noticed an underlying uneasiness in the way his fingers tapped against his desk and his eyes avoided direct contact. "This is terrible business," Brennan stated, pointing for Battle to take the chair opposite his desk. "Edmund wasn't only my partner, he was a wonderful friend. After 20 years of knowing each other, I still can't believe he's gone. I understand. The firm has been particularly busy recently, Battle said, his gaze drawn to the ordered mess of papers that covered every available surface. Oh, absolutely, we're busier than ever. These Admiralty contracts are a blessing. The Yard was struggling, even before the war preparations began. Brennan's voice was full of energy, yet his hands remained restless. Edmund was amazing on the technical side, do you understand? He could look at a set of specs and immediately identify how to improve the design and financial aspects of the company. A small delay, hardly detectable, yet noticed by a battle-tested eye. That is more of my responsibility. Edmund preferred to delegate such responsibilities to me while he focused on technical and client relations. Battle nodded carefully. The missing briefcase. Do you have any clue what your partner could have been carrying? It could have been any number of things. We have 3 main projects running concurrently, each with its own set of ideas and revisions. Brennan eventually met Battle's gaze directly. As you might expect, Admiralty is particularly concerned about security. All sensitive documents are supposed to be kept in the office safe, but Edmund occasionally took work home when deadlines were approaching. The sound of rising voices from the yard below attracted Battle's attention to the window. A number of workers had gathered around a tall, fair-haired man who was gesticulating animatedly and pointing toward the water. The man's accent, discernible, even through the glass, had the characteristic cadences of an educated German. Brennan followed Battle's gaze and addressed him as Dr. Weber. Comes around quite frequently. He conducts some sort of scientific research on coastal erosion. Indeed, Battle's interest grew. How long has he been conducting his research? Oh, it must be nearly 2 years now. I think he's a harmless man, although some locals are wary of outsiders these days. I can't say I blame them given the situation. Battle excused himself and descended to the yard, where he saw Dr. Friedrich Weber studying the pier's foundation stones with studied attention. Weber was a man of about 40, tall and thin, with prematurely gray hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent much of his time reading rather than doing outside activities. His English was good, despite a little accent that revealed his origins. Dr. Weber, my name is Superintendent Battle, and I am investigating Mr. Cast's death. I wonder whether I could say something. Weber straightened, his sharp blue eyes flickering with apprehension. Of course, Superintendent, but I fear I can be of little help. I didn't know the gentleman well, but you were aware with his movements about the harbor. In a broad sense, yes. My research necessitates careful observation of tide patterns and their impact on coastal infrastructure. The pier where Mr. Castere was discovered is especially intriguing from a geological standpoint. Battle allowed his attention to wander over Viva's equipment, including notebooks, measuring instruments, and a professional quality camera. This research requires you to work independently. The University of Heidelberg was the sole funder of a major research of English coastal erosion patterns. It is a task that demands patience and extended periods of observation, including overnight monitoring. Weber's stance stiffened almost imperceptibly. Tidal movements are not limited to daytime hours. Superintendent, some of the most dramatic changes take place during the hours of darkness. Battle's next appointment was with Captain James Morrison. Not to be confused with Inspector Morrison, a retired Navy officer who had publicly expressed his concerns about foreign observers. Battle found him at the Anchor Inn, holding court with several local men over pints of bitter and dire predictions about the war to come. Captain Morrison was a Florida man of approximately 60 years old, with a commanding presence and a voice to match. His mustache bristled with rage as he described Dr. Weber's nocturnal activities. Mark my words, Superintendent, that German chap is up to no good. Scientific study catches my eye. I've seen him wandering around the port at all hours, snapping pictures and making notes. What type of coastal erosion necessitates that level of documentation? Have you seen him at Casteur's shipyard specifically? On multiple occasions he claimed to be inspecting the pier foundations, but I observed him via my field glasses. He is significantly more interested in the ships under construction than in geological formations. Battle absorbed this information with his usual restraint, neither confirming nor dismissing the captain's concerns. The interview indicated that Weber had been spotted near the shipyard on the evening of Casteur's death, but Captain Morrison's penchant for dramatic interpretation called his testimony into question. As dusk arrived, she paced the harbor front alone, piecing together the day's events. The investigation was progressing in ways that revealed possibilities much beyond mere murder for robbery. If Dr. Weber was involved in espionage, the missing briefcase could contain the type of naval secrets that German intelligence would want. Yet something about the tidy progression of strange circumstances, troubled battles, and intuition. The fog began to roll in from the channel again, blurring the line between sea and sky, certainty and speculation. In cases involving potential espionage, Battle had discovered that the obvious explanation was frequently a convenient diversion from more mundane but equally compelling motivations. As he stood where Edmund Castere had died, Battle wondered if the secrets that had died with the shipbuilder were political or purely personal. The investigation was delving deeper, and Battle suspected that the morning's clarity would give way to murkier depths before the truth emerged. Chapter 4. Letters and Lies. The second day of the investigation began gloomy and motionless, with the suffocating silence that frequently follows violent murder in small towns. Superintendent Battle had spent the evening in deep meditation at his humble quarters above the post office, going over his notes and considering the numerous strands that were beginning to weave themselves into a complicated pattern. His morning started with a trip to Casteur's house, this time armed with a search warrant that Inspector Morrison had grudgingly but inevitably acquired. Helena Castere absorbed the news with the same collected dignity she had displayed throughout, though Battle saw a small tightening around her eyes, implying that this intrusion into her private realm was more unwanted than she cared to admit. "I see the need, Superintendent," she said, guiding him through the well-appointed chambers, "but I'm not sure what you expect to find that will shed light on Edmund's death." Battle's meticulous examination of the house yielded little of immediate interest until he came across Helena's private sitting room, a feminine refuge furnished in gentle blues and grays with watercolor landscapes on the walls. The dainty writing desk near the window was locked, and when Helena retrieved the key with apparent reluctance, Battle realized he was approaching something she had wished to keep secret. The desk's compartments held the typical domestic correspondence: bills, social invites, and letters from distant relatives. But it was the bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon in the deepest drawer that put the war on hold. The handwriting on the envelopes was clearly masculine. The return address indicated a London hotel, and the most recent postmark was dated barely 3 weeks before Edmund Castere's death. "I believe, Mrs. Castere, we should discuss these in private," Battle said quietly, his tone conveying both authority and compassion. Helena's serenity eventually snapped, but only slightly. "These are personal letters, Superintendent. They had nothing to do with Edmund's death. Maybe not. But I'm afraid I must be the judge of it." In the morning room where they had first met, Battle examined the letters while Helena sat in tense silence, her hands clutched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through the skin. The correspondence told a story that was both moving and disturbing. Over the course of 6 months, Major Charles Ashford wrote passionate letters from numerous London residences. The letters described a love that had endured 20 years of absence from a man assumed dead in the trenches of France, having survived wounds that left him physically and mentally damaged. They disclosed clandestine rendezvous in London, meticulously organized sessions that restored Helena's childhood affection before her marriage to Edmund Carstairs. Major Ashford was reported dead at Passendale. Helena replied finally, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "I mourned him for 20 years, Supervisor. When he reached me this spring, he claimed to have survived but was too damaged to resume his normal life. Initially, I assumed it was a terrible trick. But you met him 3 times in London." I informed Edmund that I was visiting my sister. Her admission seems to have required a significant amount of effort. Charles had been severely injured, spent years in a sanatorium, and lost his memory for a period. When he finally healed enough to make contact with his former life, he realized that everyone thought he had died. It seemed easier to stay that way. Battle carefully read the letters, noting references to meetings and plans that indicated the relationship had progressed beyond mere nostalgia. "Was your husband aware of Major Ashford's survival?" Helena's quiet was sufficient, but when she did speak, her words held the weight of long-suppressed shame. Edmund suspected something. He had been increasingly reclusive in recent weeks, inquiring about my excursions to London and observing me in ways he had never done before. Battle's focus on David Caster's financial predicament expanded the scope of the probe. A cautious examination at the young man's bank found debts much exceeding what could be expected from typical academic expenses. The manager, a discreet guy from the old school, declined to share specifics but acknowledged that David's account had been severely overdrawn for months. A telephone call to Cambridge provided additional alarming data. David Caster had been involved in a gambling group that included other young guys of comparable background and weak financial sense. His losses in cards and numerous sporting events had progressively increased over his last year, resulting in debts that would have been hard to repay with his allowance alone. The college dean emphasized in a weary tone that young gentlemen sometimes develop expensive habits. Mr. Caster was not alone in this way, but his position had become rather more serious than others. When Battle went to interview David that afternoon, he saw the young man in the shipyard office, trying to make sense of technical drawings that were clearly beyond his comprehension. The contrast between his superior knowledge and actual ignorance was apparent, and Battle sensed the desperation of someone suddenly confronted with problems he had never considered. "Your father was planning to bring you into the business," Battle noted, sitting into the chair previously occupied by the dead man. "Yes, though I'm beginning to realize how little I actually know about shipbuilding." David's laugh lacked humor. "Father always stated there would be plenty time to study the practical aspect once I finished my schooling." "And were you going to discuss your financial commitments in Cambridge with your father?" The question nailed the mark with striking accuracy. David's face turned pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed down the designs he had pretended to be studying. "I don't know what you mean," he answered. But the words lacked conviction. "I believe you do, Mr. Cast. Gambling debts in the hundreds are difficult to conceal, especially when creditors become impatient." The young man's poise crumbled completely. The father would have been outraged. He had very strong opinions about gambling, about honor and duty. "I kept believing I could reclaim it, that one good night would fix everything." Battle felt the usual joy of seeing parts fall into place, but he tried not to let his countenance indicate his thoughts. The Caster family was revealing secrets that extended far beyond the superficial sorrow of Edmund's death, and each discovery opened up new avenues for both motive and opportunity. As he left the shipyard in the coming dusk, he mused on the human potential for self-deception, as well as the hazardous lengths ordinary people would go to safeguard their meticulously crafted facades. The fog was rolling back in from the channel, concealing the line between truth and delusion just as well as it obscured the movements of those who chose to do their business in the dark. Chapter 5. The Price of Reputation. The third morning of the investigation brought with it a steady drizzle that appeared to penetrate into the very bones of Alderwick, making the cobblestones slick and giving the port a gloomy appearance that mirrored Superintendent Battle's increasingly grim disposition. His careful methodology was beginning to expose truths that put the victim's death in a completely different light than the espionage drama that had initially piqued his interest. Battle's appointment with Thomas Brennan had been scheduled relatively early in the morning before the shipyard workers arrived. He spotted Caster's partner at the company office, but this time the man's anxious energy had faded into something like melancholy. The ledgers that had been carefully ordered during their initial meeting were now scattered across the desk, and Brennan appeared to have spent a sleepless night wrestling with difficulties that would not be solved by morning. When the combat began, Brennan spoke without preamble. "I suppose there's no point in pretending any longer. Your investigations will eventually lead you to the truth." Battle slid into his usual chair, noting how the morning light exposed lines of strain in Brennan's face that had not been visible during their previous session. "What would the truth be, Mr. Brennan? The company was done. Superintendent, the government contracts you've heard so much about were not the salvation that everyone thought they were." Brennan's voice had the flattened tone of a man admitting to failures he could no longer hide. "The standards were so strict and the timetable so short that we lost money on every vessel we built." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Battle had already seen financial desperation, and he understood how it could push ordinarily honest men to take activities they would never have considered in better circumstances. "How long has the company been experiencing difficulties?" "Almost 18 months. We had been cushioning our losses by borrowing against future contracts, but the creditors were becoming increasingly concerned. Edmund insisted we could find a way through and that his technological innovations would eventually be profitable." Brennan laughed bitterly. He was a great engineer, but he never realized that intellect alone does not pay salaries or satisfy bank executives. Battle took careful notes as Brennan finished his confession. The picture that emerged was of a partnership under severe strain, with the two men fundamentally disagreeing on how to deal with their mounting problems. Edmund Caster was evidently confident that the missing suitcase contained groundbreaking plans worthy of more government financing, while Brennan had feared that their true financial status would eventually be revealed. The briefcase war was conducted cautiously. What did it contain? Brennan's hesitation was palpable, and when he finally spoke, his words had the weight of a man acknowledging his greatest failure. Edmund believed that his proposals for innovative hull design would provide British Navy boats with exceptional speed and maneuverability. But you had reservations about their worth. I had the drawings independently assessed by a naval engineer I know. His assessment was negative. The changes were based on sound theory, but they included elements that had been explored and rejected. During the last war, any German intelligence officer with access to the necessary technical records would have immediately recognized them as worthless. The revelation hit Battle with the force of a physical strike. If the contents of the missing bag were actually worthless, the entire espionage theory that had guided much of his inquiry was suddenly called into doubt. The ramifications spread like stones dropped into a quiet pond, challenging preconceptions and unveiling new possibilities. His midday encounter with Dr. Weber took place in the scientist's quarters above the town chemist's shop, a modest set of apartments that indicated both scholarly dedication and improved circumstances. Weber greeted him with the politeness of a man with nothing to hide, but Battle felt an underlying tiredness that suggested the German was fully aware of the concerns his presence had sparked. "I've been awaiting this conversation, Superintendent," Weber remarked, indicating toward a small sitting area lined with geological texts and scientific publications. "Captain Morrison has made his sentiments about my research quite obvious to anyone who will listen." Battle surveyed the room carefully, noticing Weber's meticulously organized notes and the obvious authenticity of his scientific equipment. "Your investigation needed extensive observations of the harbor area." "Indeed," The combination of tidal pressures and man-made buildings reveals fascinating details about coastal erosion patterns. Casstairs Pier, in particular, demonstrates stress patterns that can be repeated along similar portions of the English coast, including measurements performed at night. Weber's smile expressed real amusement. I worry Captain Morrison's military history has led him to see conspiracy where there is only dedication. Tidal movements are most noticeable during the hours of darkness, when human activity does not interfere with natural processes. Battle became more convinced of the scientist's credibility, despite the fact that Weber's nighttime wanderings had brought him close to the murder scene on the night in issue. The German's description of his movements was thorough and plausible, backed up by substantial notes and photographic evidence that indicated the scientific nature of his research. The final revelation of the day came from an unexpected place. Miss Apprentice, Edmund Casstairs' secretary, demanded a private meeting, insisting that it take place away from the shipyard office. Battle met her at a small tea shop in the older part of town, where her nervous demeanor and frequent looks toward the door indicated she was afraid of being observed. "There's something you should know about Mr. Casstairs, Superintendent," she remarked quietly. "Something that could help explain what happened that night." Miss Apprentice was a middle-aged spinster with the precise demeanor of someone who had spent decades handling the business of others with calm precision. Her revelation related a phone call she overheard 3 days before the murder. A heated exchange in which Edmund Casstairs accused someone of treason and threatened to reveal their dishonesty. He was furious, Supervisor. I'd never heard him be that angry. He repeatedly stated that reputations established on lies would not withstand the truth, and that he would not be made complicit in fraud. The ramifications of this overheard exchange put what Battle had learned in a fresh and unsettling light. As he walked back through Alderwick's small streets in the growing dusk, he was confronted with the possibility that Edmund Casstairs had died as a result of what he had discovered about far more intimate deceptions, rather just naval secrets. Fog was beginning to roll in from the channel once more, but this time the Battle welcomed its concealment. The truth was sometimes revealed more clearly when the easy reasons were removed, leaving only the sharp outlines of human drive and the tremendous costs people would pay to maintain the lies on which they had built their lives. Chapter 6. The Reality Beneath the Tide. The fourth day began clear and cold, with a sharp breeze from the channel cutting through the November air like a blade. Superintendent Battle had spent much of the previous evening in solitary reflection, enabling the numerous threads of evidence to form patterns that his seasoned mind could finally perceive. When the truth was revealed, it was frequently with the quiet confidence of parts sliding into their proper places, rather than a dramatic revelation. His morning started with a phone call to Admiral T, which verified his developing concerns regarding the true contents of the missing briefcase. The official who dealt with him was discreetly helpful, providing information that presented Edmund Casstairs' revolutionary plans in a completely different light than the dead man had imagined. "The specifications you describe were certainly submitted for consideration last month," the naval officer explained, with the care and accuracy of someone who is used to dealing with sensitive issues. "Our technical review determined that, while the theoretical ideas were valid, the practical applications had been thoroughly investigated between 1916 and 1918, and the alterations would bring no significant advantage to modern naval building." Battle digested this news with the pleasure of a man whose instincts had been proven right. The briefcase that had vanished with Edmund Casstairs contained antiquated designs that would have revealed their creator's sad misunderstanding of the value of his own work, rather than state secrets that foreign spies may be interested in. His subsequent conversation with Major Charles Ashford took place in the foyer of a small London hotel, where Helena Casstairs discovered that the man she had believed dead for 20 years was still alive, but with noticeable scars from wounds that had nearly claimed his life. Ashford was a slender, Prematurely aged guy with a tremor in his left hand caused by ancient nerve damage and haunting. Eyes like those who had witnessed too much of war's violence. I never intended for Helena to get involved in deception, Ashford replied, his voice bearing the sophisticated accents of the officer class, tempered by years of suffering. When I finally healed sufficiently to make contact with my former life, I realized that my family had long ago accepted my death. It was nicer to let them keep believing it. But you contacted Mrs. Cast. Helena was different. We'd been close before the war. When I learned about her marriage, I decided it was best to remain dead to her as well. But loneliness is a terrible thing, supervisor, and when I finally wrote to her, she answered so enthusiastically that I convinced myself that a few meetings would be harmless. Battle examined the man closely, noticing the clear sincerity of his regret and the real fondness that infused his references to Helena. Did you know that Mr. Castair had grown suspicious of his wife's actions? Ashford's face became pale. Helena added that Edmund had been asking about her excursions to London. We had decided that our final rendezvous would be just that, a farewell before I vanished from her life once more. This exchange painted a picture of two people caught between genuine emotion and the impossibility of their circumstances, with neither fully knowing how their secret had contributed to the mounting pressures that had consumed Edmund Castair in his dying days. Battle's return to Alderwick brought him face to face with the final piece of the puzzle, demonstrating once more how careful observation can disclose realities that dramatic confrontation cannot. He discovered Thomas Brennan in the shipyard office, staring out over the bay with the hollow face of someone who had understood. His carefully crafted world was about to crumble completely. "You've learned the truth about the naval contracts," Brennan stated without moving away from the window. This was not a question, among other things. Battle slipped into the chair he had occupied throughout their prior interviews. Regardless of the intensity of the situation, his demeanor was calm and unthreatening. The company was not only hurting financially, it was constructed on a foundation that was about to collapse. Brennan finally turned, and we saw in his expression the terrible exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an unbearable load for far too long. Edmund refused to accept reality. He was confident that his designs would transform naval building, and that fame and money were only a breakthrough away. When I tried to explain that our dreams were based on antiquated principles, he accused me of lacking vision. "You had the designs assessed independently." Without his understanding, the appraisal was devastating, not just incorrect, but also embarrassingly out of date. If Admiralty had found the truth, we would have faced charges of fraud and bankruptcy. Brennan's voice conveyed the flat anguish of full loss. I tried to persuade Edmund to withdraw the proposal quietly, claiming that we needed more time for development, but he insisted on presenting his plans in person to the Naval Committee. The Battle could watch the final moments of Edmund Castair's life unfold with terrifying clarity. He was taking the designs to a meeting that night. "Do not go to a meeting to destroy them, Superintendent." I had finally convinced him that the presentation would be disastrous for both of us, that the truth would destroy both of our reputations. Brennan's hands trembled as he continued. We agreed to meet on the pier at midnight, away from nosy eyes. I was supposed to help him burn the documents and come up with a reason for Admiral Ty as to why we needed to postpone our presentation. The confession that followed coincided with the gradual certainty of water reaching its level. Brennan recalled how the discussion began peacefully enough, with both men agreeing that the plans were to be destroyed, but Edmund Castair, faced with the magnitude of his mistake, abruptly refused to proceed. His pride, shattered by years of effort and recent revelations about his wife's treachery, had resisted this final admission of failure. He stated that he would rather face the penalties than live with the realization that his life's labor was meaningless. Brennan concluded by threatening to present the proposals regardless, allowing experts to determine their merit publicly. I attempted to reason with him, but he had progressed beyond sensible reasoning. The rifle, Brennan explained, was in his coat pocket as a protection against the footpads who occasionally prey on solitary walkers in the Harbor District. The weapon was almost accidentally discharged in the struggle that followed Edmund's disclosure of his intentions, though Brennan's depiction suggested that desperation led his hand more than chance. As Battle listened to the final disclosure, he felt the typical mix of joy and grief that comes with the conclusion of a case based on human weakness rather than criminal calculation. The fog began to sweep in from the channel once again. However, this time it appeared that the conflict was less about hiding and more about drawing a merciful veil over the disclosure of private shame and public failure. Chapter 7. Justice and Compassion. The arrest of Thomas Brennan took place quietly in the shipyard office, as the early sun cast long shadows across the port where Edmund Castere died. Superintendent Battle had long realized that the instant of arrest typically showed more about a criminal's genuine nature than hours of questioning. Brennan's reaction to the inevitable validated Battle's description of a guy driven to violence out of desperation rather than malice. "I suppose I've been expecting this," Brennan remarked gently, making no attempt to flee or claim his innocence. "The weight of it has become overwhelming, Supervisor. I haven't slept much since that night." Battle looked at the guy with the professional detachment that years of experience had given him, noticing how Brennan's confession seemed to deplete him of the tense energy that had marked their previous meetings. There was relief in his demeanor. Now the dreadful relief of a load being shared. "You want to make a formal statement?" Battle spoke in a tone that conveyed neither triumph nor condemnation. "Inspector Morrison will need to hear the whole story." The legal processes that followed were conducted with the painstaking precision that distinguished all of Battle's cases. Brennan's statement, presented in front of a solicitor brought from the county town, provided a detailed account of the events that led to Edmund Castere's death. The picture that emerged was not of premeditated murder, but of a catastrophe caused by the collision of pride, desperation, and humanity's horrible ability for self-deception. Helena Castere greeted the news of Brennan's arrest with the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout the inquiry. Battle observed a profound melancholy in her dark eyes, indicating more than just grief at her husband's death. She had lost not only Edmund, but also the carefully planned life they had created together, and the future now lay before her, unclear and transformed. She added, "I can't help but feel responsible as we prepared to leave the house on the hill. If Edmund hadn't discovered about Charles, if he hadn't been haunted by concerns about my loyalty, he may have embraced Mr. Brennan's advice more easily." Battle answered kindly, "You can't know that, Mrs. Castere. Your husband's pride was damaged when he discovered that his entire life's work was based on faulty ideas. That understanding would have been awful regardless of the other conditions." David Castere was more resilient than anybody had anticipated, handling the dual disclosures of his father's death and the company's insolvency with maturity that suggested the tragedies had forced him to mature above his years. The young man's gambling debts, while significant, were not insurmountable, and Battle suspected that the shock of recent events had cured him of whatever romantic illusions he may have had about games of chance. "I shall have to find proper employment," David murmured, with the woeful acceptance of someone whose comfy assumptions about the future have been irreparably destroyed. "Father always said that honest work was the basis for character. I believe I'm about to find out whether he was correct." Dr. Weber's vindication came through Battle's final report, which conclusively demonstrated the German scientist's innocence of any role in espionage or murder. The man's nighttime investigations of tide patterns had placed him near the crime scene, but his extensive notes and images provided a comprehensive and plausible alibi. "I am grateful for your thoroughness," Superintendent Weber stated when Battle informed him that he could continue his investigation without impediment. Captain Morrison's suspicions were understandable given the current world circumstances, but they made my job much more difficult. Captain Morrison himself was courteous in accepting Weber's innocence, but Battle felt the retiring naval officer would soon find other targets for his patriotic vigilance. The captain's suspicions were sincere, although misplaced, and Battle knew him as the type of man whose intuition were often important, even if his judgments turned out wrong. The case's resolution brought the usual mix of satisfaction and regret that Battle had come to expect from successful investigations. Justice had been served, but at a cost far beyond the tragedy's immediate victims. The Castair shipyard was expected to close, putting scores of men out of work at a time when jobs were already scarce. Helena Castair had an uncertain future. The revelations concerning her private correspondence with Major Ashford had an unavoidable negative impact on her reputation. As Battle prepared to return to London, he thought on humanity's ability to build vast deception buildings that eventually crumbled under their own weight. Edmund Castair had pinned his final hopes on revolutionary innovations, whereas Thomas Brennan had formed a partnership on the misguided assumption that their financial troubles might be remedied by technological advancement. Both men had succumbed to the perilous gap between aspiration and reality. The fog that had persisted throughout Battle's stay in Alderwick was gone on his last morning, replaced by clear autumn air that revealed the harbor in sharp detail. The pier where Edmund Cass died stretched out into waters that gleamed with reflected sunshine, leaving little trace of the tragedy that had occurred there. Battle knew from experience that while time would heal the wounds left by violent death, the scars would stay obvious to those who knew where to seek for them. Standing at the railway station with his small suitcase, Battle took one last look at the town that had captivated him for the previous week. Alderwick would endure this tragedy, as it had others, with its fundamental character unaffected by the temporary disturbance of murder and investigation. The human drama that had unfolded against its lovely setting had come to an end, but Battle was aware that elsewhere, other secrets were gathering pressure behind other facades of respectability, awaiting their own inevitable revelation. Epilogue. After the hurricane, Superintendent Battle had not walked the pier at Alderwick in 6 months, and the spring morning that brought him back to the seaside town appeared to promise restoration and serenity. The harsh winds of winter had given way to gentle breezes carrying the scent of salt and blooming hawthorn, and the harbor sparkled under a sky that was more blue than gray for the first time in Battle's memory of the location. He had not gone on official business this time, but rather to fulfill a curiosity that periodically led him back to the sites of previous investigations. He discovered that there was something to be learnt from seeing how societies recovered from the disturbances caused by violent crime, and Alderwick had offered a scenario complicated enough to inspire such reflection. The town exhibited few marks of the catastrophe that occurred the previous November. The shops along Harbor Street operated with the same unhurried efficiency. Fishermen repaired their nets with the same painstaking skill, and visitors wandered the waterfront with the same appreciation for coastal charm that drew them in before Edmund Castair died on the pier. However, Battle's trained eye could spot the small changes that signified a community's transition through crises. The Castair shipyard stood empty now, its gates barred by heavy chains and its windows reflecting nothing but sky. The naval contracts had been transferred to a larger corporation in Portsmouth, and the skilled workers who had earlier given the facility its purpose had dispersed to pursue work elsewhere. Thomas Brennan's trial ended in March with a finding of manslaughter rather than murder. The jury accepted the defense's claim that the shooting took place during a scuffle rather than as a premeditated act. His 12-year prison sentence was accepted. In Alderwick, with the satisfaction and anguish that communities reserve for the demise of once respected persons, Battle had given his evidence with the same meticulous objectivity that he applied to all of his professional obligations, without reducing Brennan's guilt or dismissing the terrible circumstances that had pushed him to violence. The pier had then restored and strengthened over the winter months. The local council determined that the structure's association with tragedy should not be permitted to undermine their practical importance to the community. Battle traversed the length slowly, noting how the fresh planking shined pale against the aged gray of the original structure. The location where Edmund Castere had fallen was unmarked by a memorial, but Battle lingered there nonetheless, recalling the foggy morning when he first saw the scene. His thoughts were interrupted by footsteps behind him, and he turned to find Helena Castere coming at the measured pace of someone taking her morning constitutional. She was dressed simply in a dark blue coat and walking shoes, her silver hair exposed, and her demeanor exuded the quiet assurance of someone who had weathered the worst that life had to offer. Superintendent Battle expressed genuine pleasure. "How surprising to see you here. Are you here on official business?" "Nothing is official, Mrs. Cast. I was in the region and decided to check in on Alderwick. I hope you are well." "Thank you, as expected." Her smile held a tranquility that had been absent during the dismal days of the probe. "I've discovered that time has a way of bringing perspective on even the most painful situations." They walked together toward the bay, discussing the changes that had occurred in both of their lives during the previous 6 months. Helena had sold the hillside property and moved into humble apartments in town, using the funds to set up a small trust for the families of former shipyard workers who had struggled to find new jobs. Her relationship with Major Ashford had ended peacefully, with both of them realizing that their reunion was based more on nostalgia than genuine chemistry. She explained that Charles had returned to his family with no apparent regrets. His wife had remarried, believing he had died, but his children were ecstatic to learn that their father's still living. "It felt immoral to deny them their happiness for the sake of my own feelings." David Castere had found honest work, securing a position with a shipping company in Liverpool, where his degree and family ties, despite the shadow of the previous incident, still held some value. His letters to his stepmother described hard labor and growing pleasure with a life based on merit rather than anticipation. Helena stated that he pays visits as often as possible. "The event has helped him develop significantly. I believe Edmund would have been proud of the man he is becoming." Dr. Weber continued his studies along the coast, albeit he had changed his center of operations to a town where German accents garnered less suspicious notice. His scientific work had received respect from the geological community, and Battle read with interest a recent publication in which scientists recognized his discoveries at Alderwick as critical to understanding coastal erosion patterns. As they reached the end of the pier, Helena halted to stare out over the lake that extended forever toward France. "I often wonder if Edmund would have found peace if things had been different. He was not a horrible man, supervisor. He simply couldn't reconcile his dreams with reality." "Few of us find reconciliation simple," Battle said. "Your husband's tragedy was that his pride prevented him from making a compromise that could have saved him." They stood in comfortable silence for some minutes, watching the gulls spin and screech over the harbor as fishing boats prepared to depart in the morning. The scene was tranquil and ageless, unaffected by the human dramas that had unfolded against its backdrop. "I should be returning," Helena finally remarked. "I work with the church accounts on Wednesday mornings, and Mrs. Peterson gets very upset if I am late." Battle watched her stroll back down the pier with the steady gaze of someone who had found meaning in simple routine and honest duty. The shift from the frightened, guilt-ridden woman he had first interviewed to this composed figure demonstrated that forgiveness was possible even after the most terrible discoveries. Standing alone at the pier's end, Battle pondered on what the Alderwick case had taught him about the complex relationships between public appearances and private truths. The inquiry had showed how easily respectability could disguise desperation, how noble aims might mask fundamental self-deception, and how the dread of being exposed could push ordinary people to extraordinary things. The morning light rose higher, burning away the last traces of mist and displaying the town in sharp, vivid detail. Battle could see the church spire rising above the crowded rooftops, the tiny alleys leading out from the ocean, and the lush hills that surrounded the port. Like protective arms, it was a scene of English peacefulness fit for a tourist brochure, free of the passions and failures that had formerly threatened to shatter its peace. As he prepared to leave for what he feared would be the last time, fighting brought with it the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served and wounds had begun to heal. The truth, however painful, had ultimately proven less destructive than the lies it had replaced, and the community had emerged stronger as a result of honestly confronting its shadows. The train back to London would take him to new cases and mysteries, but the quiet pier at Alderwick would stay with him as a reminder of human fragility and resilience, as well as the complex dance between appearance and reality that defined so much of the world he had chosen to serve.